To talk about the archaic, and I believe your newsletter reflected that title was a little expanded or whatever. The archaic time period is something that you're all familiar with in one fashion or another. Most of the things that we find in this area come from that particular time period and can be given that particular period name. The term archaic is simply an English word meaning old or ancient. It was my colleague in New York State, Bill Ritchie, who was a state archaeologist there for a long time, who originally started digging into sites that didn't have any evidence of agriculture, didn't have any pottery, didn't have any fluted points, and it was Bill Ritchie that finally decided he'd call all this mass of projectile points and axes and what have you the archaic period, and it's stuck. We've been using that term ever since Ritchie first published it. And it's a good term. It's and the names aren't unimportant. It's what it really is important to us is that we come to know what we're talking about when we say the Paleo-Indian era or the late woodland period, or in this case the archaic. The archaic is something that I've always been interested in. As a matter of fact, my dissertation at Penn State for the PhD was based on my studies of the archaic. I got interested in the archaic as far back as about 1947 as a camper down at Camp Mink Road, just opposite Duncan's Island, where you typically have your picnics. And John DeBarbadillo was taking all of the campers out there and rubbing our nose into the sand, and occasionally we'd bump into a projectile point. Most of them were archaic. I got hooked on it then. I still blame John DeBarbadillo for my getting into archaeology professionally. He certainly got me started. John Widoff used to show up at Minqua also, and he and DeBarbadillo and the rest of us did some excavations on Duncan's Island at the upper end of it, which is now gone. Where we did the excavations has been flooded and eroded away. But to make a long story short, it was those kinds of things that got me interested in archaeology. Archaeology is really a part of anthropology, and it's the anthropologists that go out and look at surviving primitive cultures or not so primitive cultures and get a sense about what their way of life is, and they get a sense about a continuity of a way of life. And probably the most significant aspect of continuity to us here as a group is the fact that all of you have come to recognize that certain stone tools were made according to a certain fashion. The broken broad spear that you have, Charlie, if you look at them long enough, you begin to recognize, aha, this is just like the ones that were found over here or wherever else they're found. Unfortunately, you're missing the base of it, but I can't imagine that being anything else than a Susquehanna broad spear. And so we'll all come to learn what those terms mean, and they conjure up a picture for us, and we get a sense about where they belong in time. That's what I want to talk to you about today with regard to the archaic. Now, to get back to anthropology for just a moment, we would have no way of knowing as archaeologists, and simply by finding stone tools in the field or even digging them up in archaeological sites, what those stone tools reflect in terms of a larger way of life without anthropology. Anthropologists over the last, well, they've been in business for 150 years, but it's only been in the last 60 or 70 years that anthropologists finally got around to typing societies. We've been typing projectile points for a long time as archaeologists, but about in the last 60 years or so, we've gotten very good about creating typologies for social forms. That is how people were living, what they were doing, how they made their living, what their economies like. We even get a sense about what their religion might be like. And you must say, how on earth could you ever talk about somebody's religion from having looked at some stone tools? Well, what we have to do is go to the anthropological social types, and we have to come to understand and really to agree that these social types do exist, they persist. There's still some of them out there today. Let me give you a quick summary of them. The earliest social type that we seem to know of for humankind anywhere in the world And the first one, the most ancient one, goes back at least 1 million years. It's what my mentor at the University of Michigan, who is responsible for a lot of this, called band social organization. And he found bands everywhere in the world, and they are typified by people like the Arunta from Australia, and all of the so-called Aboriginal groups from Australia. The Eskimo lived in a band kind of society. The people of Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America, were band organized peoples. There were lots of them. In fact, there was nothing but band organized peoples until about 10,000 years ago. Every artifact, every culture that you can think of in the past that precedes 12,000 years ago was those people were living according to the tenets and the outline of band social organization. The next one up the line is what we call tribal people. There are lots of those in the United States, at least there used to be. The Iroquois were organized socially, economically, politically, culturally as a tribal group. They're larger groups, they have a different kind of social organization. Typically they have a different kind of economy, very often involving the use of agriculture. No band society anywhere in the world for the first 1,000,000+ years of their existence was involved in agriculture. They simply hadn't discovered it, they didn't use it. They were all hunters and gatherers of wild foods, whether it be things on the hoof or plants or fish or shellfish or whatever. They were making their living by collecting those things from a wild state. And it wasn't until about 12,000 years ago that people started monkeying around with cultivating plants, wild plants that they were harvesting as gatherers. Eventually they discovered that by planting those seeds and tending them, cultivating them, and then harvesting them, that they could have a more reliable kind of food source. And ultimately this grows into what we call agriculture. It starts out as horticulture, sort of gardening, but eventually become agriculturalists or farmers. With that comes increases in population. It's also accompanied by a lot more conflict between various agriculturally based societies who are competing with one another. Not to say that band organized peoples didn't fight one another. There's pretty good evidence of that. The people of Australia did that. The Eskimo would fight with one another. But the reasons for it were just ever so slightly different. It's really unimportant what the last two types are, but I'll mention them anyway. The next one after tribal organization is what we call the chieftain peoples. Now we get people that are really intensively farming. We get a lot of people living together. We get scarce commodities. We get specialization of labor. And with all of that comes the slow evolution toward what we call the civilized societies. We're one of the so-called civilized societies. Elman Service called them states. Typically, anthropologists refer to them as either archaic. Let's take a look at my slides here, and I'll reiterate a little bit of this for you. But if this was just a cigar box full of arrowheads that somebody had collected over on the Swatara Creek in Lebanon County, for example, and you say, oh, geez, there were so many of them there. Was there anything different about them? Or were they all made by the same people at the same time? Well, we have come to recognize that, in fact, these are not all made by the same group. I've looked at tens and tens of thousands of projectile points. I started doing this back in the 60s and trying to sort them out. Is this one like that one? And oh yeah, here's a whole group of them. We put them aside, and we keep working on this and trying to refine it. This is the result of work that I've done. It's been refined greatly by other people. But you're looking at here, I don't know, whatever, 8 or 9 different shapes of spear points, if you will. And I have to admit to you, there might be knives. And I don't think any of these make a very good knife. A good knife is a sharp flake, especially one with a serrated edge. That's the one you can cut, do your butchering with, whatever. If these were knives, I don't think they were very effective. But they do represent 9 different types of spear points or knives made by people at a certain time in the past. Next.